Welcome to my presentation. My name is Rupi Sandhu. I'm a registered nurse, and I'll be talking to you on the topic of From Cultural Competence to Cultural Safety, a comparative analysis of Leininger and Ramsden. So I'll be introducing you to two theorists here. One is Madeleine Leininger, who developed the cultural competence theory, and Dr. Irihapeti Ramsden, who developed the cultural safety framework. I hope that through this comparison, you reflect on how nursing must evolve, not just to respect cultural difference, but to actively dismantle the conditions that make some patients feel unsafe in our care. So my objective is to explore and critically examine both Leininger's transcultural nursing theory with Irihapeti Ramsden's cultural safety framework. And in doing so, I hope that you're able to understand key principles of each theory, identify the points of convergence and divergence, so similarities and differences between the two frameworks, apply theoretical insights to your own practice, and reflect in your own practice through cultural humility and safety. So why did I choose this topic? I believe that in today's diverse and evolving healthcare landscape, that we are called to deliver care that's not just culturally competent, but it's also culturally safe. So I'm going to compare these two theorists. One's the classical theorist, and that's Madeleine Leininger. Madeleine Leininger was a nurse theorist who also was a scholar in anthropology, so that was a rare combination. Her work tells us that nurses must understand the cultural context of the patients that they are working with. And my contemporary theorist is Irihapeti Ramsden, who has contributed to the cultural care of nursing practice by telling us that we must not just understand the culture, but we also need to ensure that we are providing that safe care from the patient's lens and not from the nurses. So these two distinct approaches are both valuable in our practice today. A brief overview on Madeleine Leininger, my classical theorist. So she was a nurse scholar from the USA. She developed her theory over the 1950s to the 1990s. Leininger was one of the first nurses to highlight that culture shapes how people experience health, illness, and care. She founded the transcultural nursing theory, which encourages nurses to become culturally competent, meaning that they learn about the patient's cultural values, beliefs, and practices to provide respectful, individualized care. So a couple of the key points from her transcultural care theory are that every culture has its own way of caring. Nurses should ask, learn, and adapt their care to match the patient's cultural needs. When care fits with a patient's culture, they are more likely to feel safe, trust the nurse, and heal better. So to contrast, this is my contemporary theorist. Her name is Irihapeti Ramsden. Irihapeti was a Maori nurse from New Zealand who recognized that the Maori culture faced health inequities and something had to be done. Her time frame for her theory was from the 1980s to the 1990s. She founded the cultural safety framework, and after seeing cultural competency, she said that that was not enough, that we shouldn't just learn about people's cultures, that we also need to examine our own power, privilege, and racism in healthcare. So she advocated for systemic change. So some key points from her cultural safety framework are that care must be defined by the patient and not the nurse. Nurses need to reflect on power, bias, and history, especially for marginalized Indigenous patients. And cultural safety is about listening, unlearning, and building trust. So this slide kind of gives you a comparison at a glance. Leininger's transcultural nursing theory tells the nurse to learn about the patient's culture, whereas Ramsden's cultural safety tells us that the nurse needs to reflect on their own culture and power. So a bit of a difference there. Leininger is also telling us to learn about the patients and to be culturally congruent or culturally competent, but Ramsden tells us to focus on the power, the safety, and the patient's experience in terms of cultural perspectives through their lens. Leininger tells us that our care is individualized and it must be respectful throughout cultures, whereas Ramsden tells us that the emphasis should be on equity, anti-racism, and structural change. So she was more of an advocate for an actual holistic overview of a structural change. Leininger tells us that the nurse decides what is culturally appropriate, whereas Ramsden says the patient is who defines what's culturally safe to them. So one is rooted in anthropology and caring sciences, and that would be our classical. And the more contemporary approach from Ramsden is that we still have a lot of work to do to decolonize our own perspectives in nursing and in healthcare, as particularly towards Indigenous health and social justice. A couple of quotes here to illustrate key points. Madeleine Leininger tells us, to be effective, nurses must understand the cultural values, beliefs, and lifeways of our patients. Here you'll see a picture of nurses holding a placard up that says, "We must learn about our patient's culture." So Ramsden tells us that cultural safety is determined by those who receive the service, not those who provide it. Here you see the patients holding the sign that says, "Patients decide what's culturally safe." So here is the practice scenario. We'll apply the two different nurse theorists and their particular approach towards the scenario. The scenario is that there's a Canadian nurse who comes from a small community and she's of a European descent. She is caring for a Punjabi woman who is admitted to the hospital. The patient, who appears to speak limited English, is dressed in traditional Punjabi clothing. She is accompanied by her teenage daughter, who is wearing a Taylor Swift t-shirt and often speaks on her mother's behalf. So the nurse, though she's experienced, has had limited exposure to culturally diverse patients and wonders if this patient's attire and reliance on her daughter may influence her understanding or approach to care. How often do we see this, where you make assumptions on somebody based on how they look? Sometimes it's easy to see what competency and safety is not. So in this picture, the nurse is telling this Punjabi patient and her teenage daughter, "Can you tell your mum I need to check her pain level? Also, what language does she speak again? Indian?" So that definitely isn't cultural safety, and it's not cultural competency. India has multiple languages, so you can't just bracket someone and say that they speak African or they speak Chinese, because that's not the case. There's always different nuances to culture. So I would say that she's culturally incompetent, and that's a pretty clear example of what we don't want here. Her intentions may be good, but I don't think they come across as safe either. So what would Madeleine Leininger do? And if she approached this patient using her transcultural theory, she would acknowledge the patient's attire and family structure as expressions of cultural identity. She would ask culturally respectful questions to learn more about the patient's beliefs, languages, preferences, home remedies, or traditional healing that was used before admission. She would involve the daughter as a cultural broker, but she would also still seek out an interpreter and ensure that there's accurate communication and consent. She would probably adjust dietary preferences congruent with that person's cultural faith or preference. And she would work to develop a care plan aligning with the patient's cultural values and medical needs. So she's teaching us to be aware of that person's culture. There are some caveats because there are limitations to how she would approach this patient in the scenario. While Leininger's theory promotes respect and individualized care, it falls short when the nurse relies too heavily on general cultural knowledge. For example, Punjabi patients only eat vegetarian food, which would be risking a stereotype because there's a lot of Punjabi people that would eat meat. So it also sets the stage for centering the nurse as the knowledge holder and may intentionally lead to cultural imposition or assumptions if assumptions are made without patient's involvement. So it doesn't fully account for power dynamics or institutional racism. In comparison, let's take a look at how Ramsden would apply her cultural safety framework in this particular scenario. So Ramsden's approach would be to avoid assuming cultural norms based on clothing and language alone, because she wouldn't want us to reduce the patient's needs to just cultural stereotypes. She would tell us to reflect on the hospital settings. Does it feel safe for the patient? Are there any post-colonial remnants of colonialism? Is this a place of discrimination, language barriers? Is there institutional racism that makes this patient feel unsafe? She would create space for the patient to define what respectful and safe care feels and looks like for them by asking open-ended questions about comfort, needs, and values. And she would also acknowledge the role of the daughter, but ensures that the communication and consent are actually centered around the patient. Most importantly, the nurse recognizes her own limited exposure to other cultures and commits to ongoing cultural humility. So what are the limitations to her cultural safety framework in this example? Let's say that this nurse has done some deep reflecting and she finds it's difficult to know how to actually support that patient without proper training. Maybe she never took the cultural safety classes and doesn't really know where to begin because she hasn't had that teaching or training or ability to self-reflect, or someone to prompt that insight in her. Some nurses may even struggle with what action to take when they haven't been given a prescriptive lens like Leininger's, because the cultural safety framework can seem a bit more abstract and harder to understand. I'm going to get you to just self-reflect for a moment. I'm going to ask you to ask yourself if you have ever assumed understanding based on someone's appearance or language. Do you reflect on how your own culture and position influence care? How can you move to incorporate cultural competency and cultural safety together? So cultural competency is a starting point. It's not an end point. It's something that we have to continuously thrive towards. Learning facts about a culture is not good enough. I think we need to interrogate our own biases and systems that we operate within. Nurses are not neutral in the healthcare system. We are actually agents of change. And Ramsden reminds us that we are shaped by our own culture and how our role carries institutional power. So that power must be used with humility, justice, and respect. I think incorporating both of these two theories together only builds and improves our practice as registered nurses or as practicing nurses. I think it's something to ponder about, because I think we all have biases, whether we are aware of them or not. We have to sometimes step aside and see it from a patient's lens to understand what we think is safe is not necessarily safe for them. And that goes beyond just culture and language and religion. It also goes towards gender biases as well. So if we look at what these two frameworks teach us, they're actually telling us to be more open-minded and also check our own inherent biases and make sure that they don't influence our practice. So Ramsden has taught a lot that has built on Leininger's framework. I'm going to show you the next slide, and it may be a little uncomfortable for some, so bear with me. Take a look at the image on the right. For the first few seconds, what did you feel? For some, that symbol has a negative connotation, and for some, it actually means something prosperous and positive. So during a hospital stay, an Indian patient wears a scarf bearing the swastika. In her culture or religion, I should say, in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, that swastika represents auspiciousness, protection, and peace. Now, it's quite the opposite to how a lot of us actually see that symbol when it's tilted to the side. It was the same symbol that was taken and misused or co-opted to become something else. So I can understand a Canadian nurse being unfamiliar with the cultural origins of that and associating the symbol with Nazi Germany and racial violence. So I raise this slide here for a reason, because I think this moment asks us to ponder who defines what is safe, threatening, or sacred. In addition to that, I think it's important to say that other nurse scholars like Tevlon and company have come up with the word cultural humility, which means recognizing that your worldview is not universal, being willing to learn even when it challenges you. So I hope I can leave you with that last final slide, and if it has raised any provocative thoughts or emotions, it's elicited for you to understand that we need to set our own assumptions aside and that we have a lot of work to do to decolonize the healthcare system that we currently work in. And I hope that you continue to incorporate both of these nurse theorists in your practice moving forward. Thank you for this being part of this presentation, and I hope that there's been some positive change towards what you can also carry forward too. Thank you.